The cottage smelled like pine and old rain, the way it always did in late August, when the humidity finally broke and Lake Huron started pulling the warmth back out of everything. My grandmother had owned that property for 41 years. She bought it the year my mother was born, paid for it herself with money she'd saved from 20 years of working as a bookkeeper for a construction company in Owen Sound. She told me that story every summer. I used to think she was being repetitive. Now I understand she was leaving me a record. We were all there that weekend. My aunt and her husband, my 2 cousins, my mother, my stepfather, and me. My grandmother had asked everyone to come. She said she wanted a family weekend before the summer ended. She made perch on the Friday night, and my aunt brought a lemon cake, and for about 12 hours it felt like a normal visit. Saturday morning, she asked us all to sit on the back porch. I remember the way the light came through the birch trees. I was holding a coffee mug with both hands even though it wasn't cold. My grandmother sat in the wide Muskoka chair she'd had since before I was born, and she set a folder on the small table beside her. "I've had some papers drawn up," she said. "I want to talk about the property." My aunt straightened immediately. I watched it happen, the way her shoulders came up and her chin tilted forward. She'd been doing that my whole life whenever money came up. I used to think it was just how she held herself. I know better now. My grandmother explained that she'd updated her will. The cottage would pass to me. She was specific about why. I was the one who'd driven up every spring to open it, every October to winterize it. I'd replaced the dock boards 2 summers ago and hired the roofer when the back section started leaking. My aunt and her husband hadn't visited outside of summer weekends in over a decade. My grandmother said this plainly, without apology. She was 81 years old and she had run out of patience for softening things. My aunt's face went through several expressions quickly. She settled on something controlled. "Mom," she said, "I think we should discuss this privately. As a family, this is the family," my grandmother said. My aunt looked at me then, not at my face, at the folder. "I'm a licensed paralegal. I've worked at a small firm in Guelph for 6 years, mostly residential real estate and estate planning. I say this not to brag but because it matters to what happened next, and because my aunt knew exactly what my job was. She'd made comments about it for years, little ones, the kind that sound like observations. You must spend all day reading the, I bet nothing surprises you. What she meant was, you're a technician, not a professional. What she meant was, you're not a lawyer. She was right about that. I'm not a lawyer, but I know how property transfers work in Ontario. I know what a certificate of appointment looks like, what probate involves, what a right of first refusal clause means in a will. I know how to read a document. After lunch, my aunt found me on the dock. She sat down in the folding chair beside me without asking and looked out at the water for a moment. "I want you to understand something," she said. "This isn't about the money. It's always about the money. Your grandmother is 81, she continued. She gets confused sometimes, we've all noticed, and I think someone has taken advantage of that." I looked at her. She seemed pretty clear this morning. She has good days. My aunt folded her hands in her lap. "I'm just saying that a document signed under those circumstances when someone has been influencing her might not hold up." There it was. "I haven't influenced her," I said. "You're up here every spring, doing the maintenance she asked me to do. You're alone with her." I didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that would help. She wasn't making an argument, she was building one. I recognized the structure. I'd seen it in files. The slow accumulation of language designed to suggest undue influence, to make a natural relationship look like a manipulation. She left me on the dock. I sat there for a long time watching a pair of mergansers move along the far shore, and I thought about the folder, and I thought about what my grandmother had said at lunch, quietly, when it was just the 2 of us in the kitchen. "The will is registered," she'd told me, "and I've already spoken to the lawyer. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I held that. I didn't know then how much I'd need it. The weekend ended without another direct conversation about it. That's how it worked in my family. The thing would be said, and then everyone would pivot to whether the corn needed more butter, and whether the drive home would hit traffic, and the thing would just sit in the room, waiting. I drove back to Guelph on Sunday afternoon. My grandmother walked me to my car and held my face in both her hands, the way she'd done since I was small. "You know what's yours," she said. I drove the whole way home with that in my ears. My grandmother's health declined faster than any of us expected. She'd had a heart condition for years, managed well, and then in November she had a small stroke, and by February she was in a long-term care facility in Owen Sound. She could still speak, still knew everyone, still corrected my grammar when I visited, but she couldn't manage on her own anymore. My aunt became her substitute decision-maker for day-to-day health matters because she lived 40 minutes from the facility, and I was 2 hours away. I told myself that was reasonable. I told myself a lot of things that year that turned out not to be true. In March, my grandmother called me from the facility. She was upset in a way I hadn't heard before, not confused, but frustrated. The kind of frustration that comes from being sure about something and not being believed. "They told me I signed something," she said, "about the cottage." "I don't remember signing anything about the cottage." My chest went cold. "What kind of something?" "A transfer," they said. "Your aunt said I agreed to put it in the family trust." "What family trust?" Silence. "Grandma, do you have a family trust?" "I don't know what that means," she said. "I never set one up, I don't think I did. But they have papers." I told her I'd look into it. I kept my voice steady. I hung up and sat very still in my kitchen for approximately 2 minutes, and then I called the firm. The colleague I spoke to, a senior lawyer who handles estates, listened to everything I described and then said, very carefully, "You need to get copies of whatever was signed, and you need to do it before anything else changes hands." She was right. I knew she was right. I also knew that asking my aunt directly for documentation was going to trigger something I couldn't untrigger. I asked anyway. I called my aunt that evening. I told her my grandmother had called me, concerned about some paperwork, and I'd like to understand what had been signed. My aunt's voice was pleasant in the way that voices become pleasant when someone is choosing their words very deliberately. "It's a family trust," she said. "Your grandmother wanted the cottage protected from probate. It's a straightforward planning tool. She doesn't remember signing it. She has good days and bad days." There was the phrase again. The same phrase she'd used on the dock in August. "Can you send me the documents?" I said. "I'll have to ask the lawyer." "Which lawyer?" A pause. "The one who drafted it, not the same lawyer she used for her will." Another pause, shorter. "It was someone her friend recommended." I wrote down everything after I hung up. I'd learned that in my first year of work, write it down, date it, save it. You don't know what you'll need. Getting the documents took 3 weeks and involved 2 more calls, an email my aunt didn't respond to, and finally a call to the long-term care facility to speak with the social worker assigned to my grandmother's file. I explained the situation. The social worker was careful and professional. She told me that any concerns about a resident's capacity to consent to legal documents would be taken seriously, and that I might want to consider contacting the office of the public guardian and trustee. I already had the number. I'd looked it up the same night my grandmother called. When the trust documents finally arrived, forwarded by the facility administrator at my request, because my grandmother had asked them to give me anything related to her assets, I sat with them for a long time. The trust had been established in January. My grandmother had been in the long-term care facility since December. The document had been signed there, in her room, by a notary I didn't recognize. The trust named my aunt as sole trustee. The beneficiaries were my aunt, her husband, and their 2 children. I was not listed. The cottage had already been transferred into the trust. It was no longer in my grandmother's name, and the will that left the cottage to me, had been superseded. A trust established during a person's lifetime takes precedence over testamentary gifts. I knew that. The moment I read it, I understood exactly what had happened and exactly how carefully it had been structured. I want to be honest about the next few days, because I think people assume that when you work in legal, moments like this don't affect you the same way, that you're clinical, that you process it as a problem to be solved. I cried in my car in a parking garage in downtown Guelph for 20 minutes. I called my mother, who lives in Victoria now, and has spent years carefully staying out of anything involving my aunt, and she listened and said she was sorry, and then said she didn't want to get involved. I thanked her for being honest about that, and ended the call and sat there a little longer. Then I dried my face and went back to my desk and started making notes. The first thing I needed to establish was capacity. If my grandmother had not had the legal capacity to establish a trust in January, if the stroke in November had affected her cognition significantly enough, then the document might be voidable. The standard in Ontario for testamentary capacity is well established. But inter vivos trusts created during a person's lifetime, carry their own standard. She would need to have understood what she was signing, what assets were involved, who the beneficiaries were, and what effect the document would have. I requested her medical records from November through January. Her physician released them to me, after my grandmother provided written consent. She was still capable of giving consent for that, still herself in the ways that mattered. I sat in my car outside the medical building with a 70-page printout and read every note. The stroke had been mild. Her cognition was documented as intact in December and January. She had scored well on the assessments they ran at intake. That route wasn't going to work. The second thing I looked at was the process. Who was present when the document was signed? What did the notary do to ensure she understood what she was executing? Had independent legal advice been provided? In Ontario, a person establishing a trust of significant value, the cottage was appraised at over $400,000, would typically be advised to have independent legal advice, particularly where a family member was being named as sole trustee, and that same family member stood to benefit. There is no strict legal requirement for it, but the absence of independent advice can be relevant to questions of undue influence. The notary's notes, which I obtained through a subsequent request, showed a 15-minute appointment. My aunt had been present in the room. The notary had not asked her to step out. I wrote all of this down. I dated it. I went to see my grandmother on a Thursday in April. I drove up in the morning and arrived before lunch. She was in good spirits, sitting by the window with a large print word puzzle book, and she made me sit down and do 3 clues with her before she'd let me say anything serious. When I finally told her what I'd found in the documents, she was quiet for a long moment. "I thought it was something about taxes," she said. She told me it was about protecting the property from taxes. "It is partly about that," I said, because I wanted to be accurate. "But the result is that you've signed over ownership, and I'm not in it." She looked at her hands. She had the same hands as my mother, wide palms, short fingers. "I wouldn't have done that. I told you what I wanted." "I know. I told the lawyer too. The one I used for the will. I know, Grandma. That's what the will says. Then why? She stopped. She looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has just understood something they'd hoped wasn't true. She was here for every appointment, she said. Every time a doctor came in, every time anyone wanted to talk to me about anything, she was always here. I nodded. I thought she was being helpful, my grandmother said. The legal term for what my grandmother was describing is undue influence. It's notoriously difficult to prove, which is what people who engage in it are counting on. The person applying the influence doesn't have to threaten or coerce. They simply have to be present, consistently, at the right moments. They have to be the one who explains the paperwork, who chooses the notary, who sits in the room. I filed a complaint with the Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee in May. I submitted everything. The timeline, the medical records, the notary's notes, the trust document, the original will, the record of my aunt's presence at every appointment documented in the care facility's visitor log, which I had requested and received. My aunt called me 2 days after I filed. She was not pleasant anymore. You have no idea what I've done for this family, she said. I've been here. I've been managing everything while you drove up twice a year and played handyman. I did the maintenance because Grandma asked me to, I said. I'm not the one who drafted a trust document in a care facility without independent legal advice. That trust is completely legal. That might be for someone else to determine. She hung up. The OPGT investigation took 4 months. They interviewed my grandmother twice. They reviewed the notary's records. They brought in a separate assessor to evaluate my grandmother's current capacity, and to provide an opinion on her capacity at the time the document was signed. My aunt hired a lawyer. I spoke regularly with the senior lawyer at my firm, who couldn't formally represent me due to a potential conflict, but who pointed me toward a colleague who did estate litigation. I am not going to pretend this was inexpensive. It was not. I took money out of savings I had been putting away since I was 23. In September, the OPGT concluded that there were sufficient concerns about the process by which the trust was established to warrant a court review. The matter was referred to the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. The trust document was reviewed by a judge. The absence of independent legal advice was noted. My aunt's presence throughout the signing process was noted. The timeline, established in January, 2 months after a stroke, by a notary my aunt had sourced, during an appointment my aunt had arranged, was noted. The trust was set aside. I want to be careful here about what happened next, because it wasn't satisfying in the way that stories are supposed to be satisfying. My aunt didn't go to prison. No one was charged with anything. Setting aside the trust meant the original will came back into effect, and the cottage would pass to me through the estate. It meant the property was again my grandmother's to dispose of as she had intended. What it also meant was that my aunt and I don't speak. My cousins don't speak to me. My mother, from Victoria, sent me a text saying she was glad it worked out, and asked if I was planning to sell the property. I told her I wasn't. My grandmother knows what happened. I've never explained it to her in full detail, but she's a sharp woman, always has been, and she knows that the cottage is still hers and that it will pass to me when she's gone. The last time I visited, she was back on the large print word puzzles and she made me sit down and do 3 clues before we talked about anything else. 7 letters, she said. Rightful. I thought about it. Lawful? She considered. Counted the boxes. That works, she said, and wrote it in. I still drive up to open the cottage every spring. I pull the boards off the windows and check the dock and run the water until it comes out clear. I eat lunch on the back porch where my grandmother sat and told us what she wanted, plainly in the morning light. I used to think she was lucky that someone in the family happened to understand the paperwork. I don't think it was luck anymore. I think she knew exactly what she was doing when she asked me to be there every spring. I think she was building a record too, in her own way, long before any of this started. The birch trees are still there. The Muskoka chair needs a new coat of paint. I'll do it this summer. Some things just take time to become yours the right way.